So this week in Writing with Robbie, we actually read the third act by Giuliano.
And I got this very comically large bag of popcorn. Here's the body yada yada reference. Excuse the near nudity.
Thank you for being here because YouTube has been my accountability partner, and I have been able to read this book in 3 days, which I did not expect because obviously I am filtering my short story through the ideas in this book that he presents. But I just feel like I'm in the perfect place right at the top of my second draft where I haven't gone into it yet. I haven't looked at it yet since I sent it out to the last critique partners. But I definitely have it still a little fresh enough in my mind. And this book has kind of gotten me like re-excited to write my story. Obviously they say as you're writing your story, you're gonna get tired of it long before you finish it, but I feel like I'm not really there. I did get tired of the notes at one point, and that was a long time ago, but I felt like I have been, ever since I started this particular TBR, where I've read Story by Robert McKee, and now I've read Giuliano's book, and I've also read Dr. Octavia Butler's book, who is in the same genre of my story, or a similar genre as my story. It's kind of given me all this energy of wanting to, like, of getting re-excited about writing. I'm falling in love with writing again, and I feel like I've grown as a writer in the last month tremendously, to the point where I'm going to go back to my story edit and be hopefully far more improved as a writer, to where I can actually see more flaws than I would have seen in the story if I didn't do this TBR. So I think in doing the TBR and also viewing some of the movies that he recommends in this book before reading it, it's helped me watch stories that are accepted widely as good, and then having them dissected and critiqued, some for the better and some for the worse, and therein lies a lot of our disagreements. But let's get started with the first part that I wanted to mention, which the reason why I decided I definitely have to watch the movies that he recommended is because he says that the first act and the third act are forever linked. And I did, once he said that in the intro, I stopped to review the movie list, and it was Gladiator, where I really strongly saw.
If you don't want to hear spoilers for the movie Gladiator followed by the movie Rain Man, then I advise you to pause this video now and check the timestamps for a spoiler-free moment. Now back to this video.
In the first act, as soon as he said, you know, his desires, which not always do we get the desire so plainly clear in words, but he said his desire, obviously we could have guessed it, but he said, I want to go home and be with my wife and child. If you haven't seen it, I would skip down to the next timestamp because I'm going to completely spoil the end to the movie Gladiator. And even the next line that followed, to me, it let me know either he's going to make it home to his wife and child, or he's going to wake up in Elysium, is what he said, or a rough summation of what he said, which is to imply that he's, like he said, already dead. So him saying that, I thought there were two possible outcomes. And then when I actually watched the third act of that film, I realized there was only ever going to be one possible outcome. But more on that, Giuliano, when he goes to mention that particular scene, there was only one way that he could end this story, and that was to get his desire or not. So because they have been killed, we think that this main character can no longer get his desire from the beginning of the first act. So in seeing that, I wondered, like everyone else, well, how does this movie end? What is the point of this movie? But in the end, if you've seen In Their Way, they do, again, huge spoiler, they make it so he does eventually make it home to his wife and child. And then he talked about in Rain Man how the main character has a desire, and spoiler alert, by the end of the movie, he does not get that desire. And then answering the question to writers, is it okay that our main character does not get the desire? And Rain Man is a positive example of how not getting their initial desire then makes it a better movie. I'm glad I finished the movies first before I even continued further into the first chapter, because once he got to like the second section of the first chapter, he begins to spoil the first 8 movies on this list, and the last 9 he kind of saves for our last few chapters, or mixes it up to where some of them he spoils for like 2/3 of the book and switches to the last 9 for the last couple of chapters. But the biggest thing is that there are 17 movies on this movie list, and there are so many more movies in the book that he both mentions and completely spoils the end, which makes sense since this book is referred to the third act, which is going to include the climax, the biggest battle of your story, and also it's going to include the denouement, or the resolution of your story, things that happen after the climax, as some will define it. And he's very clear on definitions and things, but I just didn't expect, after having that 17 movie list and being told to watch it because he's going to dissect and spoil it in the book, I did not expect there to be so many, like just dozens of other movies that he mentions and spoils the ending of all of them. Like, he doesn't talk about the movies in length, but he just goes right to what the movie is about in like 2 sentences, telling you the end. So, am I mad about it? Not so much, but it did make it kind of like harder and harder to read at the end, because I was like, I would have actually watched this movie. Excuse to eat that comically large bag of popcorn. If you don't want these movies to be spoiled for you, it's good to know that those are the 17 movies that he's definitely gonna spoil. If you haven't seen them, I would watch them, but the amount of hours that it took me to watch the movies is like 3 or 4 times the amount of time it took me to read the book. It took me maybe 10 hours to read the book, which sounds like a long time, and it is a long time, but for me, over 3 days, over 2.5 days, that's really great. So I ain't mad at it. But it took, some of these movies were more than 2 hours long, so that's at least 34 or more hours on these movies that I watched. So you be the judge of whether it's worth it for you to watch them all, but likely you've already seen them all, or you've seen more than I have, because like I said, I had only seen The Breakfast Club from beginning to end, and it turned out I'd seen all the island parts of Castaway and nothing before or after, so that was unfortunate. I really needed to finish that, and I'm so glad I did. And then the 2 movies on the list that I least enjoyed, or all 3 really, the 2 that I least enjoyed were also talked about the least, so it really was just like, to me, the movie, if you've been watching these videos, you know the movie. I don't want to say the name, because to me, it rubbed me all kinds of the wrong way. I just feel like, this is the best way to experience this movie is to hear his summation in this book. That's part of the movie, which also was really kind of like rubbing me the wrong way, but just not as bad as the entire rest of the movie. Those are the parts that he focused on in the book, and the parts that I hated he didn't mention. So not going to give that any more time. Next. Also, another cool thing about this book, there were insights into the scripts of some of the movies on the list that didn't make it to the screen. Like, maybe by the time it was on screen, it was changed. So he did have some cool insights of having like read the script of a movie and then being like, actually this was gonna happen, but this happened instead, and I'll tell you why it's way better. So he had the most shocking critique for one of my favorite movies on the list.
And now there will be some more spoiling for the movies listed in the timestamps if you want to jump around based on what you've seen, or go back to another spoiler-free moment.
He says that in The Road to Perdition that the final battle was done with the wrong villain. However, I think the way that Yano describes the final battle in this book is to say that the final battle is not necessarily actually your traditional battle at all. There's not necessarily a good guy and a bad guy, like with the example of Good Will Hunting being that the the final battle was an internal battle, and so that there was going to be no fight, but there is a scene where that final battle begins. Same like in Castaway, the final battle, he gives the example, the final battle is when our main character goes to see his wife Kelly for the first time after coming back off the island. So these are our final battles. No bloodshed, but there will be tears shed in those particular cases, and they are climactic scenes. So the final battle in the movie The Road to Perdition, he is implying, is the shootout with this final villain. However, the actual final battle, I believe, and I feel pretty confidently about it, because they address it in the movie, has nothing to do with the shootout itself and who's a part of it, but more so the person holding the gun, which would be the son of the main character. Him deciding whether or not to pull the trigger. That is the answer, the climax to our final battle. Can he save his son from, from damnation? Can he save his son from becoming just like he was? So it didn't really matter who the villain was in that final battle. And because it didn't matter, and I think that's why they chose this gentleman. Like, yes, for story's sake, it probably made the more visually interesting battle. But he thinks that it would have been, Yano expresses that he thinks it would have been better to have the person who we saw as our main villain through the whole movie be the person to be the final boss, the final villain in that final battle. However, since the final battle has nothing to do with who that person is, it didn't matter, and it didn't take from the movie to have this other person. If anything, I think it added to it, because it is, like I said, it's re-emphasizing the fact that it has nothing to do with who is on the other side of this gun. It only matters the person holding it. But also, and of course the decision that he makes after holding the gun. Also, there was a part in the book that was on a different subject, but it was talking about the main character and how we need, I don't remember specifically because it's not the same category, but he was saying about whatever this element was that needed to be specifically from the view of the main character. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. So he was saying it needs to be from the view of the main character or something like that, or it needs to be set in place by the main character. So it's neither here nor there what that was about right now. But the point that I'm trying to make in saying so is I think that the villain that they used in the last part of this movie, like I said, even though it doesn't matter, I think they made sure that it was somebody who was set in motion by the person we perceive as the main villain. And they made sure to emphasize his need to finish a job, so that I think it really doesn't take anything. If anything, it adds to that side character in a last moment where it might not matter, but it didn't matter again. It doesn't matter who's on the other end of that gun. It only mattered who was holding the gun. And I think that was missed by Mr. Yano, even though I know that he's intelligent at breaking down these movies. He's capable of understanding certain things. So I think that it just might chalk up to disagreement. And not to say that he's not capable of mistakes, but he also caught those subtleties of certain kills being off screen, you know what I mean? So he didn't dwell on it, but I'm sure he noted that, and in noting that certain kills were off screen, it made it clear to the audience that those kills were not important, more so the reaction to those killings. So that being said, the final battle in this movie stands perfectly in my opinion. However, I do think that it's good that he used it as an example, because right or wrong, like, he could have picked a actually bad movie to explain this example, but then you're watching 9 or 17 or even just 3 bad movies, because he only mentioned 3 of the movies on the list in this chapter. So he could have given us 3 bad movies to make this point. Instead, he gave us 3 pretty great movies to explain how you can still make a bad ending. So the one that I'm not sure that he liked, that Mr. Yano liked, was Minority Report. And I was so shocked because y'all saw how much I liked Minority Report after being shocked to like it at all. So I think I like it more than I would have if I didn't already expect not to like it. But anyway, so Mr. Yano didn't say that I recall, rather, he really liked this movie or not, but he did say that the change of that question that was asked or created by the first act, because it was answered before we even got into the third act, he thought that was bad. And I can't remember what he called it, changing questions. So he's saying the first act creates a question and the final act answers that question. The third act answers that question. And therein lies his opening sentiment, which is that the first act and third act are forever joined. Question and answer. Enough said. But when the question changes in the second act, he's saying that can really hinder a movie. And I will say I agree with this point. Because when I was watching Minority Report, the sentiments that he's expressing is exactly what I experienced. So basically, I was watching this movie, and then at the climax of the second act, I was like, oh, well, I thought this was going to be our main bad guy. I thought this was going to happen, but I do think they did a great job of I won't say bad. He said bad, though. He said it was bad endings. So I think they did a great job of a not great or not advisable action. You know what I mean? It was not an advisable move, but they did a good job of it. They raised new questions in the same breadth of answering that first question. And we were still interested in those questions because it's not like it started a new arc. It was continuing, or maybe he would disagree. Maybe Mr. Yano would disagree. But I think it's the same arc. It's just like new questions within that arc. Like it almost could have been a sequel, I guess, except it would have just made for a really short movie. So if it was like 2 episodes instead of like 1 movie, he might have liked it better. So if they made it 2 1-hour-long episodes to do the same thing, it might have sold better to Mr. Drew Yano. I agree with him that movie was not done perfectly, and I ended up going on a kind of a rant in the book, like writing my opinion on it, how even though I disagreed, how even though I agree with his points, but I think that we still got an ending that satisfies while not being perfect. And it opens itself up to alternate endings, is what my tangent ended up saying, which is what I ended up asking for in the previous video, was for them to just do this whole story over, but make it a show and take creative license. And since he doesn't like the third act, or he doesn't like the second act, which he thinks ruined the third act of this movie, I think that leaves room for us to do a series of this show and then change how the arc ends completely. I think it opens up for Spielberg to partner with other writers or allow a new director and new writers to come in and take that story and do better. Because that's the thing, is maybe nobody could have come up with a better idea than this, but it's really easy to take someone else's work and say how it could be better. You know what I mean? So I'm saying that in a good way right now. I think we could take this great idea and let new people come, or let the old people come and say what can be done better. Because I'm saying this movie was so old at this point. It's not that old, but at this point, Spielberg himself could look at that movie and probably decide that he could have done better. In which case, I think it's been enough time that we can give that an opportunity. As you know, Hollywood loves to recycle. Mother Earth loves recycling, so why not do it with this movie that had such a great idea and so many extremely good places to go with sub-arcs and not enough time to have gone there? Why not make it a show and give it a better ending? You know what? Like I said, a sequel or a spinoff or a series initially, but I think it's gonna have to be a series. I think Minority Report should come out and be a show. I also kind of think we should change the name, because I think that the most interesting part to me was the concept of future crime. And I mean, that was something they talked about in the beginning. So they could still call it Minority Report, but the name is what kind of made me like, eh. I do still like that being the name of what they called it in the movie, but having no idea what the movie was about and then hearing it being called Minority Report, I was just not interested. But by time the concept of Minority Report came up in the movie, I was already sold. I was like, this sounds good. That's a decent name for what they're trying to call that. It's not the perfect name, but it rolls off the tongue better than other things that I had come up with in my short time thinking about it, because I did think about it. But I was like, I don't want to waste my brain cells on that. I'm writing my own story. I think there are a few things that could have been done better, but there are movies that he raved about, and I was like, well, that's the one that I didn't like. So me and Mr. Yano clearly don't have favorites in common, but I do like that he took the time to talk about what he didn't like about movies that he really liked, which brings us to the third movie that he said he liked, but he had to critique it. He had to put it at bad endings, and that is Cinderella Man. I'm not going to get into why too much, but he did imply that that movie being a historical drama, it's limited in its accuracy. And I think he's right in all of the points that he made about this movie. But again, I don't think it bears that much weight, because everything that he said was wrong with the movie, he didn't really go into it in the way that I felt it deserved to be pointed out, which is that for everything that was wrong with it, they came up with a way to make it better, to address that they knew that it could have gone into a better story, or it could have wrapped up better if it weren't based on true events. They were like, we know that this is not how our 3-act story normally goes, but this is what happened. And then they throw in other things that are true, but where they kind of can take creative license, like how he may or may not, I don't know James Braddock's life for real, but Mr. Jimmy Braddock in the movie said he was fighting for milk in that final battle. So that's not to spoil it. I'm not telling you the outcome, but that's what they said in the top of the ring. They were like, basically Yano's problems with it were that the questions and the fears brought up at the climax of the first act were basically more or less cleared up before we got to the third act. But they did still show that these problems could easily come right back in a matter of months, you know what I mean? So it was like they solved the problem, but the story wasn't over, and the problem wasn't really solved like in perpetuity. It was just solved for the moment, you know what I mean? So I think, to me, it still holds, it still has weight because of how scary it was when they weren't okay, and then how it could only take a few months to get back there. But I think you have to know that kind of struggle in order for it to have the same weight. But he did say he actually enjoyed the movie, and it was actually a begrudging thing to even include that on the list of bad endings. So again, therein lies Yano, Mr. Drew Yano, giving us a really good example of a bad thing to happen in a movie, an ill-advised move in a screenplay with a good movie. And I think that's good. It gives it value because it shows that even the greats can have errors or have problems that they have to clean up, that they don't necessarily do in the best way. And it could be and it could just be that the concept of the movie doesn't allow for a good 3-act structure wrapping up in the way that he talks about in this book, which is highly valuable. So please, writers, if I hadn't made that clear, I do think that this was very helpful. But I also want to point out that after reading this book, I feel super confident in a way that I was like, maybe I didn't need to read this book at all. But it's like I couldn't know that unless I read it. So if you feel like just if you feel like you're lacking confidence as a writer, and you are probably just thinking too much and being all in your head about it, because as writers, we do think a lot. We do live in our heads a lot. This is a book that I recommend if you don't have a lot of time and you need to know if you're actually doing all right, especially if you have no time at all. But you really need to think about it. I don't want to give his whole list because I don't want to give like the bread and butter. Okay. So where was I? And if you don't have a lot of time to get prepared, but you want to assess where you are before you get into another draft or before you start a story altogether, then I would recommend that you purchase the third act by Drew Yano and go to the very end where he puts in the first appendix. So Appendix A, which is at the end of the third act, has at the very last couple pages suggestions for questions that you can ask yourself to assess where you are in your writing. And he says he's added this to help make sure that you write the best third act possible for your story. So he's provided a checklist. I can't give you all of it here because that, like I said, is the bread and butter of the story, and I don't want to steal anything or anything, but just to give you a kind of awareness of the kind of questions that he would ask. The top question, and it covers kind of everything that he went through in the story, including things that your story doesn't necessarily need but can utilize. He writes it in a way that makes it seem like it's not very daunting at all. And that's why I just have like much more confidence on this side of the book than I did before. But when I did answer all the questions on his checklist that he provided, I felt like that maybe I was already prepared before I read this. Again, I was just unaware of how prepared I was. Not to say that I'm going to write a perfect story, but just to say that I do in fact have a story that is decent and that is being told pretty well. So really good book as far as something that you want to take on. If you feel like reading is if you feel like writing a novel or a screenplay is a daunting task, then I do think that this book would be a refreshing and lighthearted way to kind of pick it up and go through it. And like I said, you can decide not to watch the movies, as he's going to thoroughly but vaguely spoil every movie that he talks about. But it could serve you to watch the movie so you know exactly what he's referring to, so you can especially to inform opinions on your own, since he and I did not agree on some of the points that he made. But I still think this is a solid way to assess your writing, assess your ability to craft a story. And if you have no idea where your story is going, but you've already written your opening, then this would be a good way to figure out what you've already promised your reader or your audience in that first act that you might have already written. So even though things could change, as they often do, this would be a great place to just kind of get the ball rolling if you're feeling stuck. I don't believe in writer's block. I think that is a concept that just creates false evidence of being afraid of things. Why? Because there's no such thing as writer's block. Typically, there's some type of anxiety there. And what helps me is getting armed with more facts. Robert McKee in Story recommends arming yourself with research, exploring your memory and imagination. This book recommends that book, and I'm sure vice versa. But this book, like I said, it just kind of gives a more lighthearted approach, and it kind of shows you that you've already promised a certain ending. So even though this book is going to show you how how the opening act gives you the question you have to answer in your third act, a lot of writers suggest once you know that third act to then spend your edit trying to confuse or trick the reader, not confuse, but to trick the reader as to possibly the opposite happening, or will it, won't it happen type energy. So basically, you write the first act and it determines the third act, and then once you know the third act, you edit to go backwards and confuse and draw attention in a way that it makes your third act inevitable but also surprising, if that makes any sense. And both books kind of touch on making sure you surprise with that third act, is what he literally said in this book. The other book, he said something like, when someone finishes your book, they should have satisfied emotions and feel that there's no other way for that story to have ended. But he also does say that that end should be a surprise. So if the question is, like, if in the first act boy meets girl, the question is then, will boy and girl end up together? And then in the end of the third act, we should answer yes or no, leaving the second act to give the obstacles that prevent that. Boy could not get girl, boy could get girl, or boy could not get girl and get a better girl, or vice versa, or girl could get a better guy, whatever, you know what I mean? So it's just like he's telling you how to do that in this story. But however it ends, it needs to be surprising and satisfying emotionally from your first act. So both of these books were great together, especially having, like, I read Story years ago, but I had never gotten a chance to read this one, so I read Story again, and I'm glad I did have it fresh in my mind when reading this, because he mentions Robert McKee a lot, as well as some other authors who may be on that list that Will Smith provided. However, I don't want to read all the books on the list, and this was number 9 out of I don't know how many books were on that list, but I read number 1, number 2, and number 9 on that list. Number 2 does not mention number 1, but number 1 is mentioned in number 9, so I'm glad I read in the order that I did. And what made me buy this one was the title, the third act. I was like, oh great, I'm nervous about the end of my story, so I want to read that book. And the story I'm referring to isn't the one that I'm currently writing, but the story that follows the story that I'm currently writing. But when I purchased this book, I did not realize that I would be going even further in the past and writing another story. So I didn't know that I was going to need to write a whole story before the story that I bought this book for. But I'm glad I did get this book. I'm glad I read it before I start my second draft. And I'm also glad that I read it before I started the book that I bought it for. Before I started the book that I'm writing, that I bought it to help me write. Because, like I said, they're in the same kind of series, and they would be chronologically, like I'm working on book 1, and I bought this book to help me with the second book in that chronological series. But, what am I saying? So yeah, so as I read this book, I got to use it to determine where I am in the story that I'm writing, but also what I do know of the book, the second book that I'm writing, I was able to have that in mind as well while I read this. So I have mostly notes on the book that I'm actually writing, but I do have some notes on the one that will follow as well. So that's kind of cool, exciting. It made me so excited to just get to it. Like, this last couple weeks, like, I don't know if you watched that last video, but if you did, you know that I had to take a break because it was hard for me to keep in sight the depths of the reasons why I'm even watching all the movies that I was watching so I could read this book, so I could write my second draft. In the end, of course, it was worth it. I do wish that instead of spreading, like, making it really fast, like, there were 6 days and I did 3 days one week and 3 days the next week, and I wish I would have just, like, given myself the entire 2 weeks, kind of, because even though I'm on a deadline, so that's why I didn't do that. But if I wasn't on a deadline, I would not have been so anxious while watching some of those movies. But it ended up being worth it because reading this book then only took me the same amount of time it took me to watch those movies. Less time, but the same amount of days on the calendar. So it took me 3 days on the calendar to read this book, which ended up being way faster than I thought, especially with me needing to take notes and think about my story, ponder my story. So the notes that I have from it, I'm referring to as my note preponderances from this book, my preponderances from the third act. So I'm going to ponder those. I'm not sure if there will be any reading in between those, in between now and publishing, but I did recently purchase a book that I didn't intend to, and so I want to share that right now. I don't know much about it, but I do know it involves real world problems. I know that it also involves fantasy creatures. I heard that there is both werewolves and police brutality in this story. So even though both of those things are very scary, I do think that this type of fiction is the kind of stuff that inspires me and the type of stuff I want to see more people writing, which is including your art in your social justice. No pressure. If your book doesn't do that, don't worry about that. But if you're going to continue to write in your life, then at some point I want you to face the facts, or I challenge you to face the facts of reality and parallel them with fantasy worlds, because people who face discrimination or who are not embraced by their culture, they don't get erased just because the world turns fantastical. And to do that is that erasure? Is that what that means? I'm not sure, but it feels like that's probably relevant. But this is called No Gods, No Monsters, and also it is written by a very handsome gentleman of color, and his name is Cadwell Turnbull. So I don't know him, but they were going crazy. Like, they saw a black lady at the bookstore. They were like, "Ma'am, you have to read this book." I was like, I probably will, because it sounds like something I like. So I never went to that bookstore before. I've always tried to go and it would always be closed. So now that it was open, I went in and they convinced me to get this. And it only took those two. He just said police brutality and werewolves, and I was like, dang it. How does he know that I want to read a book like that? Okay. I did tell him I wanted a fantasy book, but I didn't tell him the rest. He just guessed. Okay. So that was racial profiling. That worked. So yeah, really gotta go now. I'm gonna try to get you some more awesome B-roll, but I just want to say thanks again. So if you do have a lot of time to learn, I would recommend Robert by Story McKee.